Devlogs beware, you're in for the scare. Creeps and critters and code alike, if you watch this video you're in for a fright. While old Slugler writes and tucks away, some scary monsters might show up to stay. Make sure not to get bitten by a werewolf, you may contract rabies. I really love sexy vampire ladies. And welcome Devlog. In the last episode I worked on the newly implemented combat system, and in this episode I work more on combat attack strings, combat animations, camera clipping, something else, and dodge rolling and air rolling. The first thing I did was work on the camera clipping. This is something I've already had before in the game with camera clipping, but I just use the inbuilt Unity system of the Cinemachine system for camera clipping, but I don't like it very much. It's not very good if you ask me. Personally, I just added it for ease of use initially because I was working on other systems and didn't want to be bothered to make a camera clipping system, but it got to the point where not having camera clipping was too distracting, so I made a system for it. I also didn't particularly like Cinemachine's camera clipping because personally, I felt it was too snappy and quick and a bit disorienting for players when the camera does clip into something, so if I made my own system, I could add more smoothing to this clipping degree. This is pretty simple. All I do is I change the camera's distance from the player based on if there is any raycast hit collision from the player to the camera, ignoring any layers that can be clipped into or any objects or tags that would allow them to be clipped into. For example, if I had a very thin lamppost that the player could run up, it would be on the layer that could be clipped into because it's collision geometry, so I just add a tag to that to make it be ignored. Once this has happened, we feed the distance into the camera scripting and the camera moves forward based on that distance. If there isn't any hits, it would go back to its natural point. The only real difference here is that the camera doesn't instantly snap to wherever the collision is, so if you really wanted to, you could for a few frames see into objects, but personally I would rather have this than have a sudden camera movement that the player could be disoriented with. It's better to see into an object than have the player's camera be out of their control for too long. Also, if I maneuver the camera into a wall and then walk towards it, I get a really close-up view of my character, and I get to look at her beautiful blue face and her amazing features, and boy, isn't she just so amazing. Wow. I then made a system for saving player inputs when making combat attack animations. Before, what would happen is the player would have to make a combat attack inputs during their recoil frames of an attack animation to be able to make a follow-up animation. This is essentially the frames that the player can make future attack animations where they are saved, because you can't attack while swinging and you can't attack while readying an attack, so the only attack follow-up frames that are available is in recoil animations. The issue with this is that some recoil animations may last only 6 frames, and if there's 60 frames a second, 6 frames isn't particularly long, so I wanted to make this a bit easier for players. So what I did, super easy, the player makes an input at a point where they are still attacking, and we want to use this attack for future inputs. For example, if the player makes another attack input while still swinging their weapon, all we do is we save this attack input, and as long as the player isn't making another attack input in this time, or the player hasn't finished attacking, we will use this attack input at the next opportunity when the player can attack. So if the player is swinging their weapon, they're swinging their weapon, they press the attack input for a follow-up animation, they will finish their attack, then they will go into the follow-up animation of them swinging again. However, if during this attack they pressed another input, we would swap to that saved input, or if they were damaged and knocked out of their attack, we would ignore this saved input. And this just makes attack animations a bit easier for the player to initiate combos. They don't have to make attack inputs within a very small frame windows. They have a lot more ease of time to make inputs. I then added a dodge mechanic to the game. For the explanation of what this mechanic is, it is essentially you press the circle button. If you're on the ground, you roll in a certain direction. If you're in the air, you do a little twirl in a certain direction. This gives the player invincibility frames, which is a hitbox mechanic, which means they won't take damage during these specific frames. And then after this, they can take damage while still dodging out of the way. And then after this, they have returned to normal functionality. This is a common thing in action games. It's very useful for dodging enemy attacks. So first of all, why did I do this? I needed a system for dodging enemy attacks, but the current system I have with the B function in game, or the right analog function, is the dodge slide mechanic, which I could have kept as the dodge roll mechanic, where instead of doing a dodge roll, you do a dodge slide, but I felt like it was a bit more of a movement option rather than a action combat option, so I wanted to make a nice option that is a marriage of these two systems. So I made the dodge roll, which is also a movement option because it gives you speed at the lack of control of your movements, and can also be comboed into a slide. But it can also be used for invincibility frames, and it's a bit easier to control than a slide, which is useful for combat. I said there that the dodge roll can be used into a dodge slide. This is essentially something that came up with the fact that these two functions use the same button. I didn't have any more surface buttons to change for a dodge slide input and a dodge roll input, so I just made them both activate through the circle button. What happens is if you press a dodge roll, you will do a dodge roll, and then you'll get up after the roll. If you hold down a dodge roll, you will do a dodge roll, and then halfway through your roll, you will go into a slide. I can't foresee this having really much functionality unless you're running away from a monster downhill and you want to do a dodge roll, but then you want to build more speed, so you do a slide. But I kind of just included this because it's an unnecessary mechanic, and I thought it would be funny to have a dodge slide in such an inaccessible mechanic. And I was thinking to the future of this, if this game comes out, and the fact that I'm just not going to tell people that it's a slide mechanic, and hope that people figure it out because it's not really functional or needed to be used in gameplay. If you press the dodge mechanic in the air, you will do an air dodge. This is very similar to the dodge mechanic. You just move in a certain direction, only you don't change your rotation direction. You are maintaining your rotation direction to whatever it currently was. After this functionality, we're in the air recovery state, which is the same as if we use an attack in air, so we can't use any more inputs. So if you are in the air and use a dodge, you have to really commit to it and land, otherwise you're stuck in this state. The way the system works coding-wise, as far as the movement goes, is it's very simple. As always, it's a substate system. It's a substate system, which is a override of your current movement inputs. So all this does is it clamps what your speed is going to be based on your dodge inputs. It slows this down based on if you're in the air or on the ground, based on a dodge dampening input, and then it makes it so you can't rotate as easily if you're in the air, or you can't rotate very much if you're on the ground. And your movement direction on the ground is your transform forward, while your movement direction in the air is your saved velocity amount. As I mention every single time I make a new movement subsystem, I highly recommend it because it makes making new systems incredibly easy. The entirety of the time it took to make the movement mechanics for the dodge roll was a solid 7 minutes. Really easy stuff. As for the animations, boy was I stuck on this, so I went onto the YouTubes and I googled a dodge mechanic system in Unity, and I found a very good tutorial by some weird girl called Slug G Love. I don't know, it was kind of a dumb username and she had an annoying voice, but I got the mechanics of the dodge roll down to a T with this video. In all actuality, jokes aside, I did actually have a dodge roll that I was really proud of for Proto Beats, and I lost the animation for it, so I had to make a new one. I'm glad that I did this because I think the new dodge roll is way better. If you look at it frame by frame, which I'm sure that I probably done just to show it off, it's a lot more mobile. It has a lot more movement to it. You do the same thing where you go into a handstand and then you flip back onto your head and spine. I really like how this dodge roll looks, and then if you do the dodge roll into the dodge slide, it transitions rather smoothly, I think. I was a little stuck on the motion for the dodge roll, because I feel like if you're making an action game and you do a dodge roll, it's kind of played out. A lot of action games have dodge roll mechanics, so I did want something more unique, but I really couldn't think of anything that would have the same mobility option and visual style to it. The only thing I could think was maybe something like the near dodge mechanic, where it's more of a sidestep, so I could have a sidestep mobility option, but I felt like that wouldn't chain into the dodge slide very easily, and it also wouldn't convey to the player when your invincibility frames are. If you're doing a dodge roll, it's very clear that you're dodging, but if you do a sidestep, it may not read as easily, and a dodge roll is more exaggerated and silly for my game's mechanics, so I think I'm going to stick with the dodge roll because I just like how it looks, and also I can't really think of anything else that would really have the same player feedback. As for the dodge in air system, this has 4 different animations, these being dodging left, right, forward or backwards. These are just a nice little spin. I was inspired by the air dodge mechanic in the popular videos game ARMS by Nintendo. It's a really good game, by the way, just good wholesome fun. Some characters have air dodges where they do little spins. I wanted to do that. Same reason as the dodge roll. It has a nice conveyance to the player that this is a dodge mechanic. There is a nice little visual that spins around your character when you use this mechanic. Overall, I just really like how this looks. I'm just a big fan of the air dodge system. I think maybe some of the animations could be smoothed up a little bit, but overall I do think it has this nice visual display of weight as you are dodging to the side. One thing I specifically like for the dodge animations is if you are doing a dodge roll and then fall into the air, there is a specific animation loop between 2 poses for this, and I think it looks very silly. The character just sort of is falling out halfway of their dodge roll, and then they lerp into a more pulled back version of the air dodge fall. I think it looks very silly, but it's very rare to actually see this animation because you have to actually dodge off the edge of a surface, which hopefully you wouldn't do. I then reworked our possible attack inputs. The way this worked before is that the system would detect if you were making a light input or a heavy input, and I wanted more diversity of inputs and attacks you could make based on your player systems. So all I did was input if the player has made a double press, as in they've pressed both inputs at once. This was pretty easy. And then I've also had an input for what direction the control stick is going in. So if you were to press light while also holding the control stick backwards, it may implement a different attack than if you were holding the control stick still or holding it forwards, for example. An example of this would be, let's say at the end of an attack string you have a sidestep in one direction. If you were pressing an input in a specific direction, as in your control stick, you would have a strafe to the side or strafe to the forward or strafe backwards. This adds more complexity to your attack combos and what the player can do aside from just pressing 2 buttons. They can also use input accesses. I also, as we'll see in a moment, implemented this because it makes attack combos and attack strings way more complicated by adding different inputs and different feedback information for what can happen. I also added another check, where the player will also now check if they have hit an enemy beforehand, so the previous hit has made contact with the enemy, and this can trigger certain attacks, rather than if the previous attack has not hit an enemy. We then also have further checks for if the player is targeting an enemy, if the enemy can be seen by the player, if the enemy is a middle distance from the player, if the enemy is a far distance from the player, if the enemy is in a different state to the player, a specific enemy state, a specific enemy substate, a specific player state, a specific player substate. You get the picture. It gets exponentially more complicated for specific attack strings, and my hope is to make the worst attack combat system ever, so incomprehensibly complex that no one enjoys it. I then worked on a system for more advanced attack finding. As mentioned last week, when the player initiates an attack, we will find what the suitable attack that the player should have. E.g., if they had a light attack and they press another light attack, they would initiate their second light attack combo. I liked this for its simplicity, but I want something incredibly more complicated. So now, the player will just have an array of attacks they can make with a light input, attacks they can make with a heavy input, and attacks they can make regardless of any inputs, for example, automatically attacking, but we'll get onto that. When the player initiates an attack, we will check all relative attack functions based on their inputs for what the next attack of the player should be. This is essentially just all of our base attacks that we could make regardless of what our previous attack is. Then once this attack has been made, this attack will itself have a list of possible follow-up attacks based on its inputs. Then, once we have made this attack and we initiate another attack, this attack that we are using will run through all of its possible attacks based on our feedback information and inputs and everything else that I mentioned in the last section, and it will feed back its next possible attack. So for example, if we press a light attack, we initiate our first light attack. Then if we press a heavy attack from this, we may not initiate our first heavy attack. This may go into a different kind of attack, like a swing, for example. Or we initiate our first attack and it hits an enemy, and this automatically triggers into a second follow-up attack where the player does an uppercut, for example. I actually do have a lot of these attacks planned out, but I'm not going to mention them because they're too complicated, and also it'd be more fun to just show them off once they're done. But in the current system, ignoring our base light and heavy attack strings, these are just our looping attacks if we keep pressing the light attack or the heavy attack without any other inputs or other interferences. And excluding those attacks, we have 13 unique attack states and unique attack functions with our attack combos. They can also be looped into each other, and then these ones will be able to combo into our in-air attacks, which I haven't even planned out yet. And well, I think that's a whole lot of attacks, and I want to add more. I just like having a lot of variety in attack combos. I'm not a huge fan of kind of pressing the same inputs or pressing the same attack combos over and over. I want there to be specific attack combos you may want for different situations, and also just variety of inputs. Also, it's more fun to code this way if everything's more complicated. But to summarize how this works, because it's not actually super complicated, essentially each attack has a list of follow-up attacks that can be made, and our searcher function will run through all of those follow-up attacks and then implement those attacks when a appropriate one is found, and then that appropriate one has more follow-up attacks, and etc, etc. And these can all loop around, or these can end if one attack is a finisher. So we could have a combo that infinitely carries on, or a combo that ends at some point. A benefit of the attack state finder and the new attack state system, where it is just an array of attacks I can add to a weapon, is that the attacks can get very more complex, or I can add attacks as and when I need them. For example, if I wanted a new attack string, maybe at a specific state, like for example, if you did a dash attack in the air and that doesn't have much follow-up attacks for it, all I would need to do is add some of the attack scripting code objects into this current attack, and then we would then have more fleshed out attack strings. It's as simple as just writing out new code string objects and just putting them into the arrays for each attack string. If you're of the same mindset than I am, since all attacks are code objects, I could theoretically make one weapon that just has every single possible attack string in the entire game incorporated into itself. The ultimate weapon, the Omni weapon. It will be a combination of every single weapon's mesh together, and it will have the capability of doing every single attack combo possible in-game. Finally, I worked on the attack substate system. This is the way that attacks can handle and behave rather than regular attacks. The way regular attacks work is we go from the readying, the push forward state, and then the recoil state. With these new attack systems, the attacks can do more complex, dynamic movements. So far, all I have is the slam attack, the dash attack, and the boosted attack. But again, with these being substates, they are very easy to just add new sort of attack logic as and when I need them. All I need to do is add a new state, and then I just add the code for whatever this state does. But since these are unfinished, and I don't really have the animations for any of these attacks yet because I haven't started animating them, I will just go over what they do in brief. They're all pretty simple. The slam attack is an attack where you move through the air into the ground. So the readying for this is an override where instead of taking the timer down, we wait for the player to hit the ground. Once the player has hit the ground, this transitions into our attack swing. This hits the ground, or if we landed on an enemy, does extra damage. If we have then finished this animation, so this plays like normal, does normal hit detection. It just triggers only when we've hit the ground. This then triggers into a normal swing, which is the normal hit detection, and then a normal recoil getting up animation. However, if we hit an enemy, it would probably have a different animation, but don't worry about that. The next attack state they added is the dash attack. This is any attack that is going to make it so you move towards whatever your target is. All that happens in this attack state is a very different readying animation. So for this one, it has no timer, but the timer is controlled instead by how long the animation takes with how long we travel towards the enemy. So when this attack happens, we have a logic for detecting the closest or the targeted enemy with our lock on. We will then dash towards it for our readying state until we reach the enemy, and then when we reach the enemy, we'll swing like normal and recoil like normal. Pretty similar to the slam stage, we just have a different readying state, and this changes our movements. Finally, we have the boosted attack. This isn't an attack at all, but it works like it as it is a combat system that is using this. The difference for this is the readying plays the exact same, but instead of a swing animation, this is actually a movement state. So instead of using an attack, well, I guess I probably could have an override for this also having an attack, but it's mostly a movement state. Instead of using an actual attack, we move through the air during our swing state and land on the ground once we have done. So this is for if an attack string has a back step or a side step in it, I would just, instead of having an actual attack, implement a, whatever I called this, a boosted attack, where we, instead of using an attack during our swing state, we are boosted an amount during our swing state, and we move instead, and then once we've hit the ground, we enter our recoil state, which in this instance would be landing, and then we have finished this attack. These sort of attacks are used with the automatic transition into another attack, so this attack would have a follow-up attack which would trigger even if you haven't pressed an input, so a sidestep and then a stab. So technically these are two attacks, but in-game it would probably be treated as one input because you're just pressing the input once and then the next input's automatically going to happen. These are coded in a very similar way to my movement state system. Essentially I have the base coding for how attacks work, and then I just make subsystems. And then for as many substate systems, I can just add infinite amount of these as complex as attacks need to get, because they can derive information of their basics or more complicated systems from the main scripting, and then they can use their subsystem information to derive the rest of the logic. And that is everything I have done this week. It was a fun week of development. I made lots of attacks. This week of development was mostly fun because I got to clean up my combat scripting and make it a lot more polished and easier for future attacks. I'm also more pleased with the attack in general. I think it's definitely more advanced now. The initial attack that I had last week was very simple, sort of the kind of thing you would see in a basic hack and slash game, but now I'm having attack strings and combos and launches and counters and sidesteps and things of that nature. I'm one step closer to remaking Devil May Cry 2. The best game ever made. In the next week of development, I will probably be focusing on the actual attacks for the current weapon, this being a sword and a shield, and then hopefully I will have all the animations for these and a more substantial attack string combo video, and then maybe I'll work on enemy AI, or maybe I won't. Who's to say? Like and subscribe. Ha.